decade since revolution transformed Iranian society. 30 years after the founding of the Islamic Republic, the ideals that inspired the uprising continue to inform everyday life in modern Iran. So how has the revolution managed to sustain itself through war, international isolation, economic sanctions, and regional turbulence? And how has Iranian society changed since the seismic upheaval of 1979? February 1979, Grand Ayatollah Khomeini returns triumphantly to Tehran after 16 years in exile. The revolution had been made reality, and in Khomeini, the figurehead around whom the opposition had coalesced, there was a ready-made leader.
Naturally, the Imam was the leader of the country, even before leaving for France or the revolution being shaped. He was a leader in the sense that when people follow a personality and pay attention and implement his sayings, he is a leader whether you like it or not.
And yet, beyond their hatred of the Shah, the opposition had little to unite them. There was no post-revolutionary blueprint, just the loose alignment of communists, democrats, nationalists, and Islamists. But if the revolution was to succeed, it was essential that its protagonists spoke with a single voice. Khomeini's supporters immediately began to marginalize all other elements of the revolutionary movement by any means necessary.
A struggle for the dominance and the definition of the revolutions broke out not only between the people who supported and surrounded Khomeini and other political groups and factions, but within the Khomeini camp itself about in which direction they wanted to take the revolution. It was a long, drawn-out faction struggle. It was very bloody in stages, and it was the hardliners around Khomeini who won out over the moderates in the Khomeini camp.
With no effective alternative, a referendum declared overwhelming support for a new republic. And on April 1st, 1979, less than 2 months after Khomeini's return from exile, the Islamic Republic of Iran was founded. And 30 years later, the republic not only survives, but appears more influential than ever.
The impact of the Islamic Revolution in Iran has been enormous on an international scale. I mean, it transformed the Middle East region. It removed a key ally of the United States in the West. It's really affected much of what's happened in the Middle East since then. It's only now, with an Obama presidency, that the United States, after 30 years, is coming to terms with the fact that they are going to have to deal with Iran.
But to its critics, the success of the revolution has come at a cost, in limiting personal freedoms at home and in making powerful enemies abroad, none more so than the USA. Indeed, within days of Khomeini's return to Tehran, the city's US embassy had been briefly occupied by protesters determined to end American influence in Iran.
Let me say, the revolution was in some ways not anti-Shah, it was anti-America. Because they saw America as dictating to the Shah what to do, they saw the Shah as a representative of the United States. They wanted independence. The slogan of death to Shah cannot be separated from death to America.
So the deposed Shah's arrival in the US in October 1979, ostensibly for cancer treatment, provoked outrage. Supporters of the revolution feared the visit was part of an American plot to reinstate their ex-ruler. Even today, 30 years on, mention the Islamic Revolution, and one event above all else comes into most people's minds, and it happened here behind these walls. It was something that Ayatollah Khomeini himself described as a second revolution, and it would transform the Islamic Revolution from being an overthrow of one tyrant into something of worldwide significance. On November 4th, 1979, some 300 protesters calling themselves the Muslim student followers of the Imam's line occupied the American embassy in Tehran.
They found a window they could break into at the basement level. They got a truck, I think, had pried it open, and broke into the basement level.
It was the beginning of a crisis that would provide the catalyst for decades of hostility, as 63 US citizens were taken hostage.
I went out from the door. I had one of my more unsuccessful negotiating experiences at that point. I ran into a group of very excited students. Everyone was talking at once. Everybody was giving orders. Nobody was taking orders.
The students may have seemed disorganized, but they were also deadly serious.
I was blindfolded, my hands were tied to my back, and marched out, and the rain started to fall. And I didn't know if they would just haul me out and shoot me, but they didn't.
The hostage takers were Khomeini supporters, but they had acted without his knowledge and without the knowledge of the interim government, whose members included both moderates and conservatives. Prime Minister Bazargan's deputy, Ibrahim Yazdi, was receiving the American charge d'affaires, Bruce Lengen, at the moment the students broke into the embassy.
I was at the ministry, and my deputy called me and said that the Bruce Lengen, the American charge d'affaires, is here. Something has happened extraordinary, wants to come and see you immediately. So he came, and they had some wireless phone, and they say that from inside embassy, they have been informed that a student attack, they have taken over the embassy.
I spent the next 36 hours pounding on the desks, asking for help, not getting it, appreciating that Bazargan had no power from the moment the embassy was overrun, and that power was in the streets.
Wanting to resolve the situation quickly, Yazdi turned to Ayatollah Khomeini, knowing that he would be the only one with power to expel the students from the embassy. Having once before ordered students to leave the embassy, Yazdi was certain he would do the same again. But the hostage-taking proved popular on the streets of Tehran, where crowds had gathered in support of the students.
You know, he was very sensitive to the opinion of the masses. After the takeover, the television played a very important role. The leftists, the Tudors, the extremists, all they moved toward the American embassy. There was a big rally there. And that rally was broadcast, and that rally influenced Khomeini.
In response, Khomeini gave his support to the students. And in giving the siege his official stamp of approval, he set Iran on a collision course with the US.
For the students, the fact that the Imam had supported them and said this was a revolution bigger than the first was a very attractive thing. The Imam fought the revolution against the Shah, and this incident was against American interference, and he saw it as more important. It made us very happy. It meant a lot to be supported by the Imam.
But moderates within the interim government were outraged by Khomeini's decision to support the hostage-takers.
We were a government. We could ask American embassy to close down the embassy, leave all the personnel, leave the Iran. But we could not support or endorse the hostage-taking.
I think if somebody tries to chronicle all the damages that were done to Iran as a result of the hostage crisis, and damages I mean economic, political, emotional, you will find that it is one of the most stupid, one of the costliest decisions made by any government.
Yet, far from weakening his power base, Khomeini had calculated that his endorsing of the siege would strengthen his hand.
The hostage-taking was really directed at the provisional government of Bazargan, who were all devout Muslims, but secular. Although they were nationalists, they didn't want to cut off all ties with the United States because they realized the danger of that. And one way to undermine Bazargan and undercut him was to have the hostage crisis.
The tactic worked, and Bazargan's cabinet resigned en masse. Further emboldened, Khomeini conducted a referendum on a new constitution. It embodied elements of his own Velayat-e-Faqih ideology, which stated that power rests with the clergy, and at its head is the supreme leader, in this case Khomeini himself, who was chosen by God.
The concept of Velayat-e-Faqih was one that was long in gestation. I mean, Khomeini had outlined this in 1971, but there are also quite interesting roots, you know, that can be found in Shia thought going back to the 19th century. And he basically said, well, you know, the religious authority has the primacy over the secular power.
In December 1979, the new constitution was approved by a huge majority, leaving the conservative clerics in control of the country and of the hostage crisis. The plight of the hostages would endure for 444 days until January 1981. Perhaps unsurprisingly, when freedom finally beckoned for the prisoners, they were initially reluctant to believe it.
All of a sudden, one morning, there's nobody around. And then we were told by 2 or 3 people, pack up, get yourself ready, you're going to be moved. Now, you know how many times we were told to move? You know how many times we did this? So, you know, why believe them this time? So we shuffled out, blindfolded again, put on buses, and we were driving, it seemed like interminably. It must have been a couple hours or an hour and a half. Stopped. They pulled our blindfolds off, and each person moved out of the bus.
Pushed down the steps of our bus, and jerking our blindfolds off to be taunted and pushed and shoved and screamed at by hostage takers who were determined to have their last swipe at us.
And then there was this long line of Iranians who, in some weird fashion, that was so un-Iranian to me. Now I can't understand Iran for anything because it just was so wacky to me. They started to spit at us.
The hostages were freed within minutes of Ronald Reagan's inauguration as US president, his predecessor Jimmy Carter having been voted out of office, at least in part because of his handling of the affair. The crisis may have been over, but the mutual distrust would remain.
Iran's reputation had been discolored seriously with the hostage business. As I can't emphasize too much, that sentiment of Iran as a hostage taker still out there. They take people hostage, don't they? It's unfair to Iran, the people of Iran today, but the sentiment is still there, and that's one of the first instincts, the first reactions that the public has when when Iran comes up, oh, that terrorist supporting state, particularly a hostage-taking state.
And in Tehran, the crisis is remembered as a huge triumph for the nation. This part of the museum is known as the Role of Evil, and it depicts what the authorities say is all the evil in the world inspired by the United States. The irony being that such images are being shown in what used to be one of the most important American embassies in the whole of the Middle East. But this is about much more than just symbolism or propaganda, because what happened here was a crucial moment in the Islamic Revolution, a victory by Iran over America. The hostage crisis may have fatally damaged Iran's reputation abroad, but at home, Grand Ayatollah Khomeini was more powerful than ever. By now, though, he was embroiled in another battle with another enemy, one far closer to home. Both Ayatollah Khomeini and Saddam Hussein had come to power in 1979. The previous year, as vice president, Saddam had expelled Khomeini from his exile in Iraq at the request of the Shah. Little wonder then that the two were sworn enemies. And in September 1980, with Iran internationally isolated in the wake of the hostage crisis, Saddam saw his chance to invade his neighbor.
I cannot conceive that Saddam Hussein would have dared attack Iran if Iran was not that isolated. I cannot conceive that the US would have allowed Saddam to do that if Iran was not a post-hostage crisis.
Saddam's reasons for going to war are a matter for debate. Some suggest he was worried about the growing influence of Iran's clerics on Iraq's large Shia population. Others maintain that the war was all about territory.
Some people say the maximalist goal he had was that if he attacked Iran, the regime would collapse, so he wouldn't have to deal with an Islamic Republic. I think he had a more minimalist goal, was to regain control of the Shatt al-Arab.
The Iraqis initially planned to occupy the oil-rich border region of Khuzestan, but met with fierce and unexpected resistance.
In the first days, Saddam was saying that the war will end in 3 or 7 days. He thought that the Revolutionary Guards were a young force, and the army had received big blows.
Iranian forces, with the help of Khomeini's unswervingly loyal Revolutionary Guards, pegged the Iraqi military back, and in 1982, Saddam ordered his troops to withdraw completely from Iranian soil.
After 2 years, we succeeded to kick him out of our country and free our lands. That was the golden time that we could stop the war.
Saddam sought out a peace agreement with the Iranians, but Khomeini was determined to continue fighting until Saddam had been overthrown.
Ayatollah Khomeini, was persuaded by Ayatollah Rafsanjani, his closest aide, and he was persuaded by the top commanders of revolutionary that we have to go inside Iraq, we have to release, conquer Basra. So they continued war for more than 6 years.
A war of attrition ensued, and the normal rules of engagement were quickly forgotten. The Iranians used so-called human waves of untrained, unarmed conscripts. Some as young as 12 years old were pulled out of school to attack the Iraqi front line. Meanwhile, Saddam used chemical weapons against Iran. The wider international community, keen to see Khomeini deposed, did nothing to stop him.
When Saddam attacked Iran, it caused great damage. He completely destroyed 15 of our cities. Many times he used chemical warfare. My disappointment was that some Western countries in America supported Saddam.
Nor did the United Nations intervene, even when it became widely known that Iraq was using banned weaponry. The feeling of having been abandoned by the international community is strong amongst Iranians even now.
You hear this up to this day in the rhetoric of Ahmadinejad and others, that there was this double standard, that the U.S. at best saw the UN as an avenue basically to beat up its enemies, and that it had been the victim, that is, Iran had been the victim of an unprovoked attack by Iraq, which it was, and that an attack of that was eventually supported by the international community.
It's hard to really comprehend the scale of Iran's 8-year war with Iraq, but it's when you walk around this huge cemetery of Behej Zahra on the outskirts of Tehran that you begin to really appreciate the enormity of that conflict. By the time the war ended in August 1988, after the UN finally stepped in to mediate, more than 1 million people had been killed in one of the most deadly conflicts of the 20th century.
Yes, it was a very brutal war. Saddam used chemical weapons. He attacked defenseless people in cities. When he saw he wasn't achieving his goals, he attacked oil tankers in the Gulf. It was a very difficult time. But Iranians knew that if they did not stand up against the Ba'athist army, then their lands would be forever lost into the hands of the enemy.
With the Iranian economy faltering and the military having endured such heavy losses, it might have been expected that Khomeini's popularity would suffer. But the opposite was true. He was able to use the war to further consolidate the clerical grip on the Islamic Republic and the revolution.
It is taken for granted that the war, with its ruins, costs, and martyrs, halts progress. But it was a necessity of the revolution. We had to pay the cost to strengthen the revolution.
By the time the war was over, his health was in decline. A year after the ceasefire, on June 3rd, 1989, he died at the age of 86. The nation united in grief, with more than 2 million people attending the funeral of their supreme leader.
When the war ended, there was enormous relief in the country. And it so happened that Khomeini died a very short time after the end of the war, so there was a new leadership. And the new president, Hashemi Rafsanjani, made it a major part of his policy and platform to say now the focus will be on internal reconstruction. So Iran entered a period, a post-Khomeini period, in which the great figure of the revolution was no longer there. His lieutenants had to make the decisions on their own.
Given how pivotal Ayatollah Khomeini was to the Islamic Revolution and the Republic, one would have thought that on his death, Iran would have faced an era of uncertainty, even instability. But it was the clergy as a class who are now in power, and they left nothing to chance. The succession was quick and decisive, and the role of supreme leader fell to Ayatollah Khamenei. And the smooth succession has continued to this day. The Islamic Republic of Iran remains a formidable regional presence, whose power is arguably greater than at any time during the last 30 years. And throughout the last 3 decades, there has been another constant for Iran: ongoing enmity with the USA.